This is the Con Variation. This is the Paulsen Variation. While this may be the Con Variation, this is the Paulsen Variation. And I can tell you right off the bat, these two variations are where you're going to have your most impressive looking sacrificial games, especially in over the board chess. And I say this because this has been my experience, especially over the board, and once I go over the thematic P sacrifice in this variation, I think you'll see exactly why. So in this position you may be thinking, as the player with the black pieces, why would I ever want my knight on e7? Aren't I going to develop to c6 anyways? Wouldn't these two variations always transpose? And you would be mostly right, but there are a few differences based on move order that we need to go over. The first one I'd like to point out, I already went over in my introduction video to this series, but if they ever start a6, very common in these two variations, instead of starting with knight f3, we do need to start bishop c4, otherwise they can play an early b5 and prevent us from coming to this nice diagonal. We'll be out of theory on move 5, and our bishop will be relegated to a more passive square. Now obviously they can't start b5, which I can show because we can threaten mate immediately. They fend with their knight, we capture. This forces them to sag the exchange. Here they play e6, the Con variation. We stick to our normal Smith-Morra Gambit plan, developing our second knight, and it's in this position that I would like to analyze the early b5, because this will be the main difference between the Con and the Paulsen, this line right here. So they play b5, planning to fianchetto their bishop obviously, and I have an important rule for you guys here that is very counterintuitive but extremely important to remember. Whenever they kick our bishop in this manner, we want to completely ignore the engine's suggestion of going back to d3. We always want to stay on this nice diagonal, and the reason that is counterintuitive is I realize it feels a little bit like we're biting at a granite here, but I think you'll find we have a very clever way of removing this pawn. The early bishop e7 is the line we really need to worry about here, and as I said in the last episode, generally in the Smith-Morra, if our opponent is playing a reputable defense, which they are right now, we want to stick to our normal Smith-Morra Gambit plan, playing queen e2, rook d1. It's when they deviate and play inaccurate moves that we deviate as well. It's important in chess to remember not to be aggressive for the sake of being aggressive. Your aggression should be the logical conclusion to some sort of miscalculation or inaccuracy on your opponent's part, and it just so happens that we're playing an opening system that's about to create a lot of those. And it's here that I'd like to pause, and I'd like to introduce you to the thematic P sacrifice in the Con and in the Paulsen variations of the Smith-Morra Gambit accepted. And that thematic P sacrifice, which we're not going to play right now, is going to be knight d5. So how do we know when to sacrifice our knight? Well, it just so happens one of the best chess books ever written, Mayhem in the Morra by Mark Esserman, covers this topic very in depth, and I would highly recommend buying the book yourself and reading that section. But to quickly summarize, Mark Esserman gives 5 rules, and they're less rules, they're more considerations. Once you see these things, you should start calculating the knight sacrifice on d5. And these 5 rules are as follows. First, no pawn on d6. If they have a pawn on d6, that's going to make our sacrifice much less effective. So no pawn on d6. The second rule is there is a knight on c6. And the reason for this one should be pretty straightforward. After we sacrifice on d5, should they accept the sacrifice, we want to recapture and open up the king with tempo. The only way to do that is if there's a knight on c6. The third rule is going to be our bishop has retreated to the b3 square. The reason for this one is actually interconnected with knight c6, because after we sacrifice our piece and recapture with tempo, they can actually gain the tempo back with knight a5 unless our bishop is defended, which it is if we've already retreated back to b3. So it's important to remember this sacrifice has a lot more potency if our bishop is already defended on b3, because they can't win their tempo back after we recapture. And I'll go through plenty of examples, don't worry. Our next consideration will be that black is at least one move, but preferably 2 or more moves, away from castling to safety. That means we're going to want at least one of their minor pieces undeveloped on the king side. And the final consideration, which I'll show right now, is that black plays b4. If your opponent plays b4, they are practically begging for the knight d5 sacrifice. And I'll be showing how to convert this specific one, not only because it's the first one we're going over, but because when there's no knight on c6, the sacrifice tends to be a lot more positional and strategic than it is tactical, so there's actually a good bit to talk about. So we'll assume they recapture, and considering we can't capture back with tempo, we're going to make it so we can recapture with tempo with rook e1. This will be much different than how we play the accepted sacrifice lines where we capture with tempo. Here the best move by far is to recapture, putting them up 5 points of material, but as you'll notice the engine says we're +1. That's because we have a very sneaky resource, knight e5, threatening to capture on f7, and you may notice there is no good way to defend this pawn. In my opinion, this is the most straightforward way to convert the knight d5 trap in the Con variation. Next, let's move on to the Paulsen variation. This is the Paulsen variation. Once again, our opponent is playing a reputable defense, so we'll stick to our normal plan by castling. And what do we notice about the most common move? It seems like we're about to go into pretty familiar territory, so let's assume they play b5. Remember, our rule will always want to retreat to b3 here, staying on this nice diagonal, even though it's sort of counterintuitive. By far the most common, and I would argue the most logical move, is bishop b7, fianchettoing your bishop. And it's here that I'm starting to notice some of our considerations. First, There is no pawn on d6. Second, there is a knight on c6. Third, our bishop is on b3. So that's already 3 of our considerations. This is looking ripe for a sacrifice. Our 4th consideration is that black is at least 1, but preferably 2 or more moves from castle. You'll notice they haven't developed on their king side at all. And finally, black plays b4. Now you usually won't get 4 of the 5 considerations, but I would say whenever you start to see 2 or 3, it's sort of worth calculating. Now this is a trap that occurs in hundreds of unique positions, so it's not enough to just memorize. Beyond our considerations, we also will need to calculate and use our own judgment. Sometimes the sacrifice will work, sometimes it won't. So let's go through this and let's calculate it out together. The first thing I would look for are the considerations, and we have 4 of 5, which is very strong. The next thing I would look for with the Nd5 sacrifice would be, where is my opponent going to move their knight? After all, that's our tempo gaining move. Right off the bat, knight e7 doesn't work because we can just push and then pin. So it seems logical that the best move would be knight a5, after which there's still nothing stopping us from checking and then pinning our opponent's piece. So by the end of this, we won't really be down material, and we will be opening up our opponent's king. To me, that's a green light. Let's do it. Now as the black player, when you're playing against this sacrifice, almost always the right move is going to be knight a5 if you play this line in the Sicilian, but even at the higher levels, a ton of people will accept this sacrifice, thinking it's unsound. And part of that is the reputation that the Smith-Morra Gambit has, especially at the higher levels. People don't respect it, so they don't study it. And that's how you end up with situations like Mark Esserman destroying Von Whaley's super grandmaster with this exact trap. So they accept. We take back with tempo, I assume they go a5. I think the engine just preferred developing, which makes sense. But it's hard to spot as a human. We'll stick to the plan I mentioned before, we'll check, and then we'll get ready to pin their piece and win it with our pawn. We have a crushing position, let's move on. Now if I change my filters to be only 2000 and above rated, you'll notice people stop taking the sacrifice and they start playing knight a5. So as you climb up the rating ladder, you will start to run into this knight a5 idea more, but even then I would argue knight d5 is by far the best move in this position. We're not just playing for tricks. And another pattern you'll notice in the Smith-Morra is that the Smith-Morra sacrifices confuse the engine a lot, so sometimes it's worth letting it go a little bit deeper. So knight a5. Here the correct move to remember, because you will run into this, is bishop g5. Obviously we're threatening their queen here. Blocking with f6 is by far the most natural, that way both of our pieces are still hanging. But you notice since they moved their f-pawn, this diagonal is completely open. If you're playing the Smith-Morra, you're an attacking player, so this is pretty nice. And the last move we'll need to remember for this line is a very, very cool one. After all, they can't collect all of these pieces in the same turn. Might as well sacrifice another with knight e5. If you've done a lot of puzzles, our threat here should be very, very obvious. We'll follow the most common continuation where our opponent falls for it with knight takes b3. And here we deliver the queen check, because we can in fact recapture the pawn when it pushes to g6. So those are the most 2 common instances of the knight d5 trap that you'll get in your games. As for that reason, I would highly recommend remembering the conversion, but for all of the other instances of the trap, I would rely on your calculation and Mark Esserman's consideration. I'm updating my filters now in case anyone's following along. One more important line to cover in the con is this idea with queen c7, an idea taken straight out of the titular con Sicilian, and I would say really either retreating your bishop but playing queen e2 is perfectly playable here. The engine prefers bishop e3. Personally, I prefer queen e2 because we're gonna want to play for this plan anyways, and having an x-ray to the king like this feels very nice to me. I'm going to show an example variation. I'm going to cover up the engine analysis and the table, that way you have to think for yourself, and we're going to assume they play b5 here. We retreat our bishop to b3 like we always do, and then they go bishop b7. Now my question to you is this a good opportunity to sacrifice on d5? What's the first consideration? Well, there's no pawn on d6. What's the second consideration? Well, there's no knight on c6, which is bad. So 1 for 2 so far. Next, is our bishop on b3? It sure is. Is it going to be a while until our opponent can castle? Yes. And finally, has black played b4? No. So feel free to think on it for a second. Would you sacrifice? And leave your answer in the comments below as well if you don't mind being roasted. Here, I would say the sacrifice is probably playable, but I just don't quite see the compensation for the piece. And this is something you'll run into a lot, where the knight d5 sacrifice works in principle, but it's still not the best move, and that's why it's important to always calculate this out and take a few minutes when you start to see these considerations. Don't forget, we are sacrificing an entire piece, and when there's no knight on c6 and we don't get that tempo back, we need to have positional compensation that's worth at least a piece. The line I see looks something like knight d5, capture, Capture with check, they'll probably block with bishop, and then this pesky queen on c7 is going to keep us from winning our piece back. So I would not sacrifice here. But if you did, it probably wouldn't be the end of the world. And out of curiosity, I wonder what the engine eval is. Lower than I expected a little bit, but the engine seems to think we get 2 pawns of compensation for our knight here. Not nearly enough for a full piece. And the cool thing about these variations is it really is that conceptual, and you're already pretty much ready to play it. Just remember the considerations for the knight d5 trap, and if they don't play any kind of inaccuracy like that, just stick to your plan by castling queen e2, rook d1, and your other rook of course wants to be on the c file, like always. So the final thing I'd like to go over is just a normal middle game position if they don't fall for the knight d5 trap. So we'll start with knight c6, the Paulsen, we'll castle. So worth mentioning by the way, we do have a really tricky move in this specific position. I know someone in real life that plays this line, where instead of retreating like normal, they'll play bishop d5, which is sort of a different take on the same sacrifice. I consider this a little bit playing for tricks, but it's a really cool option to look at, especially in like blitz and faster time controls. Worth mentioning. But we will of course want to retreat to b3, and here instead of getting greedy and falling into our trap, they're going to start to develop their pieces, hoping to capitalize on being a pawn up. Our dark bishop in the Smith-Morra Gambit usually wants to be on f4 or g5. If you watched the episode on the pin variation, this should look very familiar. We want to pin their knight, so we are going to go to the g5 square. Then the rest of our pieces of course want to develop in the same way they usually do. If they ever kick our knight either way, we're going to come back to e3, and it's worth mentioning that once this knight's on e7, the knight d5 trap is of course off the table completely. But you will occasionally see players like this that neglect their queen side because they realize they need to get their king safe. I'll quickly run through some common moves. We come back to e3. I would like to quickly go over this move, knight g6, because I've literally had this. If they don't capture, we have the best knight ever. If they do capture, we recapture. To be honest, the most common move is sort of ridiculous here, setting themselves up for a pin, because after d6 is of course defended, they can't capture, they can't develop, and after queen f6, we have bishop d4, pinning everything. That's assuming our opponent defends anywhere near that accurately. We're pinning everything, let's move on. So that's the refutation for knight g6, you will see that sometimes, and it'll be a very cool looking win when you do. So let's assume they don't miss the plot and undefend d5, and instead they play the best move, bishop b7. Here our opponent's done everything right, so we're just going to stick to our normal Morra plan. Queen e2, rook d1, rook c1. They find knight a5 and you're under like 2100. There's a 90% chance they're using an engine here, but I just wanted to show if they play knight g6 here as well, the exact same plan works with knight d5. After we recapture, we have this nice discovered check, and it seems like the average player throws the game immediately. And I've got to be honest, that's really all you need to know about these two variations. Let me know if you have any questions below in the comments. Make sure to drop a like on the video, and thank you for watching. Also, don't forget to join our Lead Chess team. The link is in the pinned comments. And for the next episode, I believe we'll be covering the Sicilian.
Chess Gambits Explained will help you train